Remember how Governor of New York Kathy Hochul said that she's willing to take the Second Amendment back to muskets, and that the safest states in this country are the blue states like New York, in part because of their anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment agenda. Well, this has been entirely proven false, of course, which we knew it would be. Kathy Hochul's decided to deploy 1,000 members of the National Guard to New York City's subway system, which specifically was talked about during Bruin as a place you could not make a quote-unquote sensitive place. Let's break all of this down when we get back, and I'm going to show you the absurdity of what Kathy Hochul's trying to do in the New York City subway systems and why it's unconstitutional when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar, and author of many books, including Disarm: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, well, we have an act of performance art. Right? We have a mime in the streets of Paris that has now been brought to the New York City subway system by Kathy Hochul, that anti-gun, anti-Second Amendment governor of New York. She has decided to deploy 1,000 additional law enforcement officers and the National Guard to the New York City subway systems. A fool's errand, to say the least. This conduct by Kathy Hochul and her decision is simply security theater. And what I mean by that is it has the appearance of creating a secure environment, but it's simply not the case. It is pure theater. It is performance art, as I like to say. And the reason why I say this is, to begin with, it's bad public policy what Kathy Hochul's doing. Set aside the question as to whether or not this is the equivalent of martial law. I don't think it goes that far, but it certainly creates the impression of martial law. But let's go beyond that for a moment. First of all, it's just stupid policy and it's unconstitutional. Let's just start why it's stupid policy, because I have sort of a unique perspective here in the Second Amendment community, in that I'm very familiar with New York City, having practiced law there and worked there and lived there for decades and been in part of the New York scene in the highest levels. So I'm quite familiar with how the whole New York thing works. So let me just cut to the chase here. This is utter nonsense. They've had these sort of like security entrance protection points with guards and NYPD before. And here's the harsh reality of it, or the good reality of it. I have never been stopped at any of these places ever, when I've gone in or out of the subway at all. The reason why, of course, is they just randomly select people, okay, at most. And if you happen to be selected, you can simply be like, yeah, I'm not going, and turn around and come back up. Because remember, you don't have to go into the subway system. So if they select you and you're a bad guy with bad stuff to do bad things, you simply won't go into the subway there. You will leave that subway station and go to another subway station and another subway entrance, and then go through there. That's what's going to happen. Keep in mind that they're not checking everyone that goes on the subway. They're just randomly selecting some people. My guess is they're selecting less than 0.5% of the people that go into the subways are being selected for any kind of search whatsoever. Beyond that, of course, they've already admitted there's no way to do this. They do not protect every single subway entrance. They're not at all the subway stations. There's, hundreds of subway stations. They're not at all of them. There's multiple entrances into these subway stations. They're not at all of those entrances. So this is all, again, a waste of time. There's also the practical reality of this. If any of you have ever, when you are at like a Yankee Stadium, or you're watching a Mets game, or the Knicks, or the Nets, or the Rangers, or any of these sports teams, or you go to the U.S. Open, the reality is, or you go to Broadway Theater, for example, when those events get out, when the theaters get out, when the games are over, people leave the stadiums, they leave the parks, and they go into the subway station. And the reality is there's thousands, tens of thousands of people are like, going into the subway. There's simply no possible way to search any real percentage of that, or certainly can't check them all. So it's just, again, a total waste of time. It's about creating an impression that something is being done when it is simply not occurring. Now, with that said, in addition to being just bad public policy, there is a silver lining here for the Second Amendment community. And that silver lining is this is an admission, the most powerful kind of admission in favor of the Second Amendment. That admission is by virtue of the actions of the governor of New York. She is the same one that after NY Serpa versus Bruin was decided by the Supreme Court in June of 2022, She said she was going to fight back against the Second Amendment, and if she could get back to, and this is literally what she said, if she could go back to muskets, that is where she would take guns in America. She's a total loser, obviously. We get that, but she's in a state of New York, and New York is a terrible place at this point. I think most of the productive people have left the state. If you're smart and can get out, they're gone. Okay, so with that said, Kathy Hochul says, I'm going to take the state back to muskets, the Second Amendment back to muskets, and she encouraged and called a special session to enact terrible anti-gun policies, including declaring essentially the whole state a sensitive place. And in that context, she declared that subways were sensitive places, which, as you know, is a euphemism for government-mandated gun-free zones. So she said with a sign, no guns in Times Square, no guns on the subway. Obviously, that has failed entirely because there's a reason why they're deploying these thousands of law enforcement agents and National Guard to the subways because of rampant violent crime. Right? And that means that the gun-free zone signs obviously are not working. We knew that. She probably knows it too, but she has to virtual signal to her anti-gun billionaire donors, is my guess. But whatever it is, she has to virtue signal that she hates America, that she hates American life, that she hates the Constitution, and she hates the Bill of Rights. And that's why, among other things, she hates the Second Amendment as part of that gestalt that she appears to have to convey, or at least she thinks she has to convey, which is kind of odd. But nevertheless, that appears to be what's going on, in my opinion. And if you look at it, I think my opinion is borne out by the facts on the ground by Kathy Hochul's behavior in the state of New York as the governor. Now, let us carry on. Is this constitutional? This is clearly not constitutional. And by what I say is not constitutional, I'm not talking about the security per se, because remember, they're not forcing you to undergo a security check. If you don't want one, you can walk out of the subway station. So this is in some ways metaphorically like the infamous or famous stop and frisk policy, where they would stop people and frisk them for guns during the Michael Bloomberg mayor years. This is a little bit different here because, again, you can simply walk away and not be searched, not be frisked. With that said, this is unconstitutional, meaning the government mandated gun-free zones, the sensitive place laws are unconstitutional, pretty clearly under that. There are three sensitive places identified by Bruin, right? There's the legislative assembly, for example, the U.S. Capitol, courthouses, and, of course, polling places. Now, we've talked about the history here. If you go back in time to the founding era, what brought those things together, the sort of common denominator, was they all had armed government-funded security, whether there be sheriff's deputies, bailiffs, sergeants at arms. The point is these discrete, narrow areas were protected by people with guns, and they had comprehensive security and things like that. Again, we'll do a more detailed video on all that. We've talked about this before. Now, obviously, none of this is the case with the New York City subway stations, because, of course, the reality is that this is not actual security, right? It does not ensure that people are not getting on the subway armed, and that's the key. If you're going to have comprehensive security, and you're going to say, as the government, that we will provide security in this discrete area of the country, that means you have to make sure that no one has guns in that space other than law enforcement, because you are the law enforcement agency that you're going to take control of that environment 100%, and no one is allowed to have guns, and no one is able to get guns in without basically, because of the way the comprehensive security works. So simply saying that you're providing comprehensive security but failing to do so is not enough to take away one's Second Amendment right to have a gun in case of confrontation, which is what the Supreme Court says. So again, if they're making getting on the subway the equivalent of getting on an airplane through TSA, where once you cross through those TSA checkpoints, no one has a gun, but the government, and they're taking over your personal safety, your physical safety, that's one thing. But if you don't have that, it is simply not good enough to take away people's Second Amendment rights. That's just the bottom line constitutional. The courts are still working through this, but this is where I think they're going to wind up. Now, I should also say that the benefit to the comprehensive security approaches is also objective in nature. The question is, well, has the government actually provided comprehensive security where people cannot bring guns into that area because they're secured? And does the government provide ample armed guards to make sure that people that get into that security zone, quote unquote sensitive place, that they're adequately protected? Okay, so the bottom line is this is stupid policy for the reasons why I've just articulated, and of course is unconstitutional. And I just want to sort of summarize this video with a very funny, and I'll put a link to it down below, Babylon Bee piece. All right, to summarize this, I just want to quote a title from the Babylon Bee, a hysterical website. They're satirical, but frankly, they make some great social observations through satire. And keep in mind that the thing that totalitarians and tyrants hate the most is satirical humor, because if you parody them or make fun of them, they really have no rebuttal to that, and they hate that. And that's why I'm really happy that the Babylon Bee does a great job in satirizing much of American society today. So what they did is, when this policy was announced, they came out with an article, which I'll put a link to down below, that I found to be quite amusing, but actually quite telling and accurate in concept. Here's what they write. With Daniel Penny arrested, NYC is forced to deploy the National Guard to protect the subway. The article goes on to say, with Daniel Penny unavailable after being arrested for protecting New York's subway system, Governor Kathy Hochul officially deployed the National Guard to protect New York City's subway system. Quote, this is, of course, satirical, quote, we desperately need the National Guard to come do exactly what we arrested Daniel Penny for doing, close quote, announced Governor Hochul. Quote, civilians have become too afraid to confront violence on the subway for reasons we cannot determine. We are left with no choice but to send in men with military training like Daniel Penny to protect New Yorkers from violent, mentally ill people on the subway. We would have asked Daniel, but obviously he is under arrest for doing exactly what we are now begging the National Guard to do. Period, close quote. So to wrap up, although that quote from Kathy Hochul is apocryphal, I mean, it's not true, it's satirical, right? Although it conveys, I think, the sentiment in some ways she's conveying, we must always remember that it appears that some members of our political elite class seem more interested in protecting the violent thugs in our society, the criminals in our society, the illegal immigrants in our society that have broken into the country, that are staying here illegally, and are working with false papers illegally, 3 crimes by my count. It seems to me there's members of the political class that are more interested in protecting those types of people than they are in protecting law-abiding Americans and not allowing us to exercise our right to keep and bear arms, which is a guaranteed pre-existing right guaranteed by the Second Amendment. So it's very interesting to see this dynamic where certain officials like Kathy Hochul seem to be much more interested in letting criminals go free and violent criminals to do bad things under the policies that they created. And then their answer is more government, more military, more law enforcement, more government spending, more social workers, more welfare. You see how that game gets played? They create the problem by letting violent criminals go out of prison, by having by not having cash bail, which is the law in New York, for example, for most crimes, by letting people escape and get arrested over and over and over again and nothing happens to them, by letting shoplifters steal up to $1,000 worth of goods before anything bad can happen to you. All these policies are about emptying out the prisons of criminals and violent thugs to basically prey upon ordinary Americans who are just innocently trying to go about their daily lives, living the American dream. If they can pull that off, that's the goal, of course. But it seems to me that that's what these politicians want to do. They want to allow this bad stuff to go rampant, and in exchange for that, when the problem becomes obvious, their answer, as Kathy Hochul just did here, and now with New York City subway systems, their answer is more and more government, more armed government agents, not respecting the Constitution and letting Americans protect themselves with firearms as guaranteed by the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court precedent, but instead an excuse to justify ever-expanding government agencies and ever-expanding government power over Americans. One wonders if that is a random event or not. I'll let you speculate as you see fit in the comments below, and there you have it. Bottom line is, we'll keep following this New York City story, but I think in the end, it will be good news for the Second Amendment because it's the sort of thing we can point out to the courts, including, yes, indeed, the United States Supreme Court. So there you have it. Okay, folks, hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Make sure you subscribe at Four Boxes Diner to me on X, and again, resubscribe here so you don't get knocked off the list, and we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.